Good afternoon, and welcome to everyone attending today's forum here in Washington, D.C., as well as those by webinar. I'm Betsy Warner, and I'm responsible for developing the teacher evaluation agenda at the National Center for Education Evaluation at the Institute of Education and Sciences. And I'm really excited about today's event and about this opportunity to discuss a few of our studies with you and to basically discuss what we might be learning that might improve policy and practice. The two studies we will be highlighting today include teachers who choose to enter teaching into alternative routes, as well as those who choose to enter teaching via traditional routes. A key distinguishing feature of traditional routes is that these teachers become the teacher of record prior to their completing all the education coursework required for certification. In addition, typically the amount of education coursework that these alternative route teachers pursue doesn't require as much coursework. Of course, that varies by state and sometimes even within states depending upon the program. The first study listed here includes teachers from the most common alternative routes, those that have entrance criteria similar to that of many traditional route preparation programs. Because these routes accept almost all those who apply, we label these less selective alternative routes. The second study is more focused on two large, highly selective alternative routes. Those are Teach for America and the Teaching Fellows Program. We call these highly selective because less than 15% of those who apply to these programs actually are admitted. The final thing that I have listed here is an evaluation brief that we just released today, which basically is a synthesis of these two studies and gives us a little bit of sense of what we're learning from the two studies. Today, authors for both reports will provide an overview of their studies with an emphasis on informing two major issues. One has to do with the extent to which these alternative routes are expanding the pool of prospective teachers. And of course, we want to know whether they actually look different than those who would have attended traditional preparation routes, just to see whether they actually are getting more into the teaching profession than would have happened otherwise, as well as we want to take a look at what's their effectiveness. So they'll be talking a little bit about that, because you hope that by lowering barriers, you're still having teachers at least as effective. The second issue that we'll be covering today really has to do with using the inevitable variation that happens through these different routes, the inevitable variation in the types of preparation, and comparing that to the teacher's effectiveness to help us understand better what sorts of features might be useful in informing how to improve teacher preparation, more generally, regardless of the route. So I'm pleased to introduce each of our distinguished panelists and direct you to today's agenda to get a little bit more information, but let me just briefly describe them. Jill Constantine is Vice President and Director of Human Services Research at Mathematica's New Jersey headquarters. She is the Project Director for the first study being discussed today. Melissa Clark is a Senior Researcher also at Mathematica, and she is the Principal Investigator and the lead author for the second report and second study that we'll be talking about today. We're also honored to have two distinguished guests to offer comments and insights on the presentation, and quite frankly, this is the part I'm most interested in hearing about. Vicki Bernstein is the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of Human Resources and Talent for the New York City Department of Education. Due to this and her previous role as Executive Director of Teacher Recruitment and Quality, I anticipate that she will offer a great perspective from that of a user of these various routes. Russ Whitehurst is the director of the Brown Center on Education Policy at the Brookings Institution. As the first director of the Institute of Education Sciences, I expect Dr. Whitehurst will have some interesting thoughts to share related to the perspective of policy and research. Our plan today is to have each of the study authors take about 12 to 15 minutes to provide a brief overview of their study. Then we will have each of the discussants take another 10 minutes, 12 minutes or so to provide comments. At the conclusion of their presentations and comments from our panel, we'll entertain questions from both our in-house and our webinar audiences. And incidentally, for those who are joining us by webinar, you can provide questions through the Q&A panel, and you can do this at any point along during the forum. A few housekeeping items, although it's pretty quiet in here. I just want to remind everybody that we're videotaping this session. So if you would, please silence any electronic devices. And I also wanted to alert you that we may capture images of some of you in the audience. Okay, so just be on notice about that. And now I'm going to turn over the podium to Jill Constantine.
Thank you, Betsy, and welcome everyone to the forum. I'm going to be discussing findings from the first study that Betsy mentioned, the evaluation of teachers trained through different routes to certification. This study was conducted by Mathematica on behalf of IES. To set the policy stage for this study, at the time the study was conducted, less selective routes to certification were training and supplying a large number of teachers to the classroom in the states that promoted these paths. Less selective routes were well established in approximately 12 states at that time, but they were expanding rapidly, both in those states and in other states. In the states and districts where this study takes place, they had been an important method for responding to teacher shortages for some time. Also at that time, there were some studies comparing teachers from traditional alternate routes, but none were very rigorous where you could really separate the effect of the district and the schools and the students from the teachers themselves. So to make sure we're all understanding the terms we're going to be using, as Betsy suggested for this study, we defined teachers from traditional certification as those that came from programs where they were required to complete all of their coursework and student teaching before they became the teacher of record. Essentially, that means before they flew solo in their own classroom. This typically occurs as part of an undergraduate education, but it might occur as part of a fifth-year post-baccalaureate program. Compare that to teachers from alternative certification programs. Those are those programs where they were not required to complete all or sometimes any of their coursework before they became the teacher of record, and there was no student teaching as part of their program. Okay, so to kind of further sharpen the study focus, and again to make sure we have a common understanding of terms, we wanted the people who entered these different routes to be as similar as possible academically. So we defined the less selective alternative certification programs as those that did not require a GPA of anything higher than 3.0 and didn't have any other obvious highly selective criteria like high SAT scores or very competitive undergraduate institution or any program that seemed to just take a very small percent of their applicants. We actually developed that definition by looking at the average admission criteria for traditional certification programs. So that allowed us to both make sure the groups were similar academically, to actually make sure we captured most alternative certification programs, most are less selective, and to clearly distinguish it from these highly selective programs like Teach for America, which you'll hear about in the next presentation. Next, we took advantage of this variation in required coursework that Betsy referred to. So there's very large variation in required coursework among alternative certification programs. Some alternative certification programs require very little coursework. Some require a lot. As Betsy said, this is generally state-driven, and in some states, teachers who go through the alternative certification path have to take just as much coursework as those that went through the traditional path. From there, we split the teachers from alternative certification programs into two groups. One that took relatively little coursework, which we imaginatively refer to as the low coursework group, and then one that took relatively more coursework, which we'll refer to as the high coursework group. By splitting it into two groups, that allowed us to get to two aspects of this debate on teacher preparation. One is this timing aspect. Anytime we're comparing the teachers from the alternate routes to the traditional routes, we're able to look at, well, is it important to have completed all of your coursework and student teaching before you enter the classroom? But when we split them into these two groups, we can also, within that, say, and then does it matter if you, along your path, that you were required to complete a lot of coursework at some point? So with that setting and framing, we had two main research questions. The first, what are the effects on student achievement of teachers trained through different routes to certification? That first question is designed to answer a critical question for the principals and goes to the heart of the debate about teachers trained through different routes. That is, if a principal hires a teacher from an alternative or a traditional certification program, what should she expect in terms of student achievement of those teachers on average? The second question we look at are what aspects of teacher preparation are associated with teacher effectiveness. And we're going to look at the amount of coursework, timing of coursework, as I suggested, but also the content of the coursework. We're going to look at whether any of those features were associated with student achievement. And we have different methods for looking at these two types of questions. But so that you don't have to wait to the end to get to the punchline, our main findings are here. The overall findings are students of teachers from the different preparation routes perform the same in reading and math on average. However, if a teacher is taking a lot of coursework while they are teaching, that is not good for student achievement. And then the third finding is that variations in the amount and the content of required coursework was also not linked to teacher effectiveness. So we still have not identified what about teacher training programs or the teachers themselves appears to be most related to effective teaching. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the study design. We used the strongest research design to answer that first question, what I call that principal's question. What's going to happen? What should I expect if I hire a teacher from these different routes? And so basically what we did is we identified schools that had novice, and we defined novice as 5 or fewer years of teaching. So novice teachers who came from both alternate and traditional routes and were teaching not only in the same schools but at the same grade level. And then we took those teachers at the same grade level and we randomly assigned students to them for that school year. Okay? So what made that design distinct is that entire structure. Okay, we're in the same district, same school, same grade level, and that we accounted for all of those factors, your district, your school, your grade level, and the composition of the students themselves in the design of the study. And that means any differences in student achievement at the end of the year, we can attribute to the teacher. And the last thing to keep in mind is, and that means we are only looking at the effect of the teacher. It's not a direct test of the effectiveness of the program, but of course that is the principal's question. They are hiring a teacher. They need to know what to expect might happen on average. And more of the context for where the study occurred in the sample. It was in 7 states, again, that all had well-established alternative certification programs by that point, 63 schools. 174 teachers. The sample was accumulated over 2 years, the 2005-2006 school year, but all students were just tested at the beginning, the baseline of their school year, and then at the end of the school year. These are all elementary schools, K through 5, but 2/3 of the sample were in grades K through 3, and that does reflect the typical placement of novice, alternatively certified teachers in particular. The other thing we did is we collected a lot of information, not only from the teachers themselves, we got a lot of information on their characteristics, but also of the programs, admission requirements, amount of instruction required, content area, timing of instruction. We learned a lot about the programs. And we didn't know a lot systematically about alternative certification programs in particular, and you can look at the report for more detail. So, given all that information we gathered, let's look at what we learned. This first slide shows us this helps us look at this question of the amount of coursework required. And we split it into our 2 groups, the low coursework alternatively certified teacher and the high. So if you look at that top bar there, that shows for that group we classified as low coursework, they took on average, that bar is it's 179 hours of, they had 179 hours of required coursework. Compared to those traditionally certified teachers teaching at the same grade in their same schools, they had completed over 670 hours, okay? So a very big difference. Those low coursework are only required to complete about a quarter of what their traditionally certified counterparts had to. And then when you look at the teachers that came from those higher coursework requirements, alternative certification programs, they completed on average 432 hours, and their traditionally certified comparisons were about 601. So still a difference, but much less of a difference. They're completing about two-thirds of what their counterparts completed. And then again, the report shows you how that actually looks by content area too, if you're interested. And then the next interesting finding is this issue about the timing of the required coursework. So here I'm actually going to start with the teachers from the high coursework alternative certification programs. So this shows how those, on average, 432 hours were divided up. So they complete a substantial amount before they get into the classroom, about 150 hours. And then they're completing about another 150 during their first year of teaching, and then they have about 131 more after that first year during the summer and the second year. So that's quite a lot of teaching in particular during their first year of teaching. Quite a lot of coursework while they're teaching in their first year. And then for the teachers who came from the lower coursework requirements, they're completing even a higher percentage of their coursework before they get into the classroom, 115 hours, leaving themselves about 63 for when they are teaching during that first year. And again, this varied quite a bit by state. In one state, those low coursework requirement states, they didn't have to complete any before they walked into the classroom. But as you can see, in most places, they did have to complete some. But that contrast we were looking for in terms of the total volume of required coursework is certainly there for both groups. And then the last area, descriptive, important and interesting descriptive area we looked at, gets at this question that Betsy raised about, are these alternative paths drawing in different types of people? Okay? And we did find some pretty large demographic differences between teachers from alternative certification programs and the traditional program. Specifically, alternatively certified teachers were 4 to 6 years older than their traditionally certified counterparts, depending on if you were looking at the higher or low coursework. They were more likely to be African American. They were less likely to be white, and they were more likely to have children. They were far more likely to have children if they were in that low coursework group. They were less likely to have majored in education as undergraduates, and no surprise, given that previous graphic, they were more likely to be taking some coursework while they were teaching. So another important finding of this study is that alternative certification programs are drawing in a different type of teacher demographically. They're older, they're more likely to be minority, and they're more likely to have children. And this makes sense if you think about an individual who wants to become a teacher now but needs to work while they're doing it because they're possibly supporting a family. And that's a very different group than you'll hear about, again, when we look at the findings for the highly selective programs. Okay, and next we'll get to those final findings on teacher effectiveness. So the overall message is that novice alternatively certified teachers were neither more nor less effective than their traditionally certified counterparts. But here again, we're going to break it up into the two groups. We looked at both reading and math, so those little bars are for reading scores and math scores. On the left-hand side, that's looking at the low coursework alternatively certified teachers compared to their traditionally certified counterparts. And you see these very small negative differences. That means the students of the alternatively certified teachers scored lower, but these are very small differences and they're not statistically significant. When you look at the high coursework teacher, you look at reading, that's that funny zero hanging out. It is zero. They just scored exactly the same as the students of the traditionally certified teachers. And then you see this largest negative difference of the students of the alternative certified teachers scoring lower in math. And that's an effect size, so it's bigger than all the other differences, but that also was not quite statistically significant. And in the next slide, I will describe what's driving that difference. So the last thing we looked at were different groups of teachers. We were able to look at this differences by geographic region, by grade level, by years of teaching experience, and there were two things that came through as a statistically significant difference. students of alternatively certified teachers in California scored statistically lower in math than students of their traditionally certified comparisons. It was a big difference. It was a minus 0.13 of an effect size. We can describe that if people have questions. And it was statistically significant. Now, California is one of those states, the requirements for alternatively certified teacher, it's all high coursework. In fact, they have to complete as much coursework as their traditionally certified counterpart. So when we go back and look at that negative finding there, that minus 0.07, that is entirely driven by California, right? That's half of that sample right there. There are high coursework ACs in other states, but it's not negative. So it's really driven by California. And you might go, oh my goodness, so what's going on there in California? Well, that's confounded by the next finding, which is students of alternatively certified teachers currently taking coursework scored statistically lower, again, in math, than students of their traditionally certified counterparts. That was also statistically significant. And once again, that is driving this finding, and it's also driving the California finding, because as you saw from that earlier graphic, particularly if you're in a high coursework program, you have a very heavy coursework requirement during your first year of teaching. Other than that, there were no other program characteristics, and we looked at all kinds of different aspects of the content of the program. No other teacher characteristics, their major, their SAT scores, selectivity in their undergraduate institution. None of those things were related to teacher effectiveness, and we did look at this, again, a number of different ways statistically. So the bottom line, answering those two questions, for the principal, the bottom line is it is okay to hire teachers from the different paths. You should expect, on average, the same performance for student achievement. But if that teacher is currently, a message for both the principals and policymakers, designer of these programs, is when teachers are taking a lot of coursework, that year is not the best year for their students in terms of student achievement. So it's important to be mindful of that from the principal's perspective and from the designer of these programs. But in terms of that second question, we still can't predict teacher effectiveness very well based on particular programs, characteristics of the programs or of the teachers. And with that, I will turn it over to Melissa to talk about the more highly selective programs.
Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to share the findings of this study with you today. It was just released on Tuesday, so I'm really eager to hear everybody's questions and comments. But this is really the first large-scale random assignment study of the effectiveness of secondary math teachers from Teach for America and the Teaching Fellows programs, which, as Betsy mentioned, are really the two largest of these highly selective alternative certification programs. So to give you a little bit of background on the programs, they both follow fairly similar models. The Teaching Fellows programs were actually established by a Teach for America alumna. So over the years, the programs have had very collaborative relationships and have shared materials and curricula. So they follow these fairly similar models. They both recruit and select high-achieving individuals. They provide them with 5 to 7 weeks of intensive training in the summer before they start teaching. They help the teachers find jobs in high-poverty schools and often in hard-to-staff subjects like science and math. And then they provide the teachers with ongoing training and support after they begin teaching. Despite their similarities, the programs do differ in some important ways. So one way in which they differ, Teach for America focuses primarily on recruiting recent college graduates, while the Teaching Fellows programs focus more on recruiting mid-career professionals who are looking to change careers and begin teaching, although both programs do recruit from both pools of candidates. And the second important difference is that Teach for America requires its teachers to make only a 2-year commitment to teaching, although the teachers can choose to remain longer, and some certainly do. While the Teaching Fellows programs actually don't require any formal commitment to teaching, but they recruit candidates with the expectation that they'll remain in teaching for the longer term. So our study addressed two main questions. So like the previous study, we were really interested in the principal's question of what effects should we expect on math achievement from hiring a teacher from this program versus that program. So the questions were, compared with other teachers teaching the same math courses in the same schools, how effective are secondary math teachers from Teach for America, and how effective are secondary math teachers from the Teaching Fellows program? So just to summarize our main findings, we found that the secondary math teachers from the Teaching Fellows programs were more effective than the other math teachers in the same schools. So on average, the Teach for America teachers increased student math achievement by the equivalent of about 2.5 months of additional math instruction. So a meaningful gain in student math achievement from being taught by a Teach for America teacher. And we found that secondary math teachers from the Teaching Fellows programs were at least as effective as, and in some cases more effective than, other math teachers in the same schools. So in particular, the Teaching Fellows teachers were more effective than teachers from less selective alt-cert routes, and novice Teaching Fellows, those in their first 3 years of teaching, were more effective than novice teachers from other routes. Like the previous study, ours used a rigorous random assignment design. So within each school that participated, students signed up for a particular math course, for instance, Algebra 1, were randomly assigned to a class taught by a Teach for America or Teaching Fellows teacher on the one hand, or to a class taught by a comparison teacher who entered teaching via some other route, either a less selective alternative route or a traditional route to certification. And unlike the previous study, we did not place any limits on the teaching experience of the teachers in the sample. We did this in part because we wanted to be able to address this concern about Teach for America teachers that they do make just a 2-year commitment to teaching, and they may tend to leave teaching sooner to sort of see how they compared to more experienced comparison teachers. But we're also able to just compare novice to novice teachers and experienced to experienced teachers. And then to estimate the effectiveness of the teachers, we compared students' math test scores at the end of the school year. And because, again, because the students were randomly assigned to the teachers, we could pretty definitively attribute any differences in their math scores at the end of the school year to the effectiveness of their teachers rather than to underlying differences in the types of students that these teachers were teaching. One important note is that we can't compare the effectiveness of the Teach for America and Teaching Fellows teachers to one another. The reason for this is that in our sample, the Teach for America and Teaching Fellows teachers were largely teaching in different schools, different grade levels, different math courses. So we really don't know how teachers from the two programs would have compared if they'd been teaching the exact same types of students in the exact same schools. So we're really just comparing teachers from Teach for America to other math teachers in the same schools and Teaching Fellows teachers to other math teachers in the same schools. I think a nice strength of this study relative to some previous studies in the literature is that we had large multi-state samples. So the Teach for America analysis sample had over 4,000 students in 11 districts and 8 states, and the Teaching Fellows sample also had over 4,000 students in 9 districts and 8 states. And in terms of data collection, our primary outcome measure was student math achievement, which we measured by state math test scores for the middle school students. And then for the high school students who aren't assessed at every grade level in every state, we instead administered a subject-specific test in Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and Geometry. And these were computer adaptive assessments from the Northwest Evaluation Association that are fairly widely used. And so that's what we used here. And then we also had a rich set of information on teachers' characteristics. So we surveyed teachers on their background characteristics and their preparation for teaching. And also because there's a lot of interest in how teachers' math content knowledge might contribute to their effectiveness in teaching math, we gathered teachers' scores from the Praxis 2 math assessment to measure their content knowledge in math. So looking at the characteristics of the teachers in our sample indicates that Teach for America and Teaching Fellows programs really do seem to attract very different types of teachers into these high-poverty schools. So they looked very different than the teachers we were comparing them to in the same schools. So relative to the comparison teachers, the Teach for America and Teaching Fellows teachers were younger, much more likely to be white. They were more likely to have attended a selective college. They had much less teaching experience on average. They were less likely to have a master's or bachelor's degree in math, but nonetheless, they still scored significantly higher on the Praxis 2 math assessments. And then in the case of the Teach for America teachers, they were more likely to have taken coursework during the study school year, which is probably due to the fact that most of them were in their first or second year of teaching, and they were still taking this required coursework for their certification. So turning first to our findings on the effectiveness of the Teach for America teachers, we found that the Teach for America teachers were more effective than the comparison teachers. So this first bar on the left shows how the test scores of the Teach for America teachers compared to the test scores of all the comparison teachers. So on average, the Teach for America students outperformed their peers by 0.07 standard deviations. And when you compare this to the typical growth in test scores that students experience across a year of secondary school, this translates into roughly 2.6 months of additional math instruction. So it's really a meaningful gain in student math achievement from being taught by a Teach for America teacher, although the Teach for America students were still scoring below average at the end of the school year. We found that the Teach for America teachers were really more effective across the board. So this middle bar shows the effectiveness of the Teach for America teachers relative to teachers from traditional routes to certification, and you can see they were significantly more effective with a 0.06 standard deviation gain in students' test scores. And by the same token, when we compare the Teach for America teachers to the teachers from less selective alternative routes, you can see that, again, the Teach for America teachers were more effective. We also looked at how novice Teach for America teachers compared to both novice and experienced comparison teachers. And here we're defining novice teachers as those with 3 years or less of teaching experience, and experienced teachers as those with more than 3 years of experience. And so you can see that the novice Teach for America teachers outperformed the novice comparison teachers by 0.08 standard deviation gain in student test scores. But you can also see in the bar on the right that even the students of the novice Teach for America teachers outperformed the students of more experienced comparison teachers. So this latter finding, I think, is really relevant to this debate or this criticism of Teach for America, that their teachers are only making a 2-year commitment to teaching and they tend to leave after just a few years, and therefore they're less effective. That finding did not bear out that claim did not bear out in our study at all. So even these least experienced Teach for America teachers were more effective than the more experienced comparison teachers. So turning to the Teaching Fellows program, we found that the Teaching Fellows teachers were just as effective as the comparison teachers, and in some cases they were more effective. So this, you can see on the left, this lack of a bar indicates that the 0.00 indicates that the students of the Teaching Fellows on average performed exactly the same as the students of all the comparison teachers in the study. When we compare the Teaching Fellows to teachers from traditional routes, there was no difference in their effectiveness. So you can see this bar is a negative 0.03. That's a small difference, and it's not statistically significant. So they performed about the same. But you can see from the final bar that the students of the Teaching Fellows outperformed the students from less selective alternative routes by 0.13 standard deviations. So again, a really meaningful gain in students' math achievement from being taught by a Teaching Fellow relative to a teacher from a less selective alternative route. We also compared the Teaching Fellows to comparison teachers by their experience level, and in this case we compared novice Teaching Fellows to novice comparison teachers, and you can see that the novice Teaching Fellows were more effective than the novice comparison teachers. Again, a gain of 0.13 standard deviations in test scores, a pretty large gain from being taught by a novice Teaching Fellow instead of a novice comparison teacher. We then compared more experienced Teaching Fellows, those who've been teaching for 3 years, more than 3 years, to more experienced comparison teachers, and they had about equivalent effectiveness. So you can see there was a test score gain of 0.03 standard deviations among the Teaching Fellows students, but that gain was small and it's not statistically significant. So we conclude they're about the same in terms of their effectiveness. So finally, as in the previous study, we also took a look at other factors besides the teacher's route to certification that might predict a teacher's effectiveness in the classroom. And what we found, the bottom line was really that it's difficult to predict teacher effectiveness. So we looked at a range of teacher characteristics that you might readily observe from a teacher's resume. So the selectivity of the college they attended, the college courses they took, their math content knowledge from their praxis scores, student teaching experience, and coursework. And we found, with a few exceptions, that none of these factors we looked at predicted teacher effectiveness. So this is consistent with the previous study we just heard about, and it's also consistent with much of the literature on this topic, which shows that it's very difficult to predict a teacher's effectiveness in the classroom just based on these readily observable characteristics. There were a few exceptions. So we did find that teaching experience was positively associated with a teacher's effectiveness. And we found that some evidence that a teacher's math content knowledge was positively associated with effectiveness. And we also found that, similar to the previous study, that coursework taken while teaching appeared to decrease a teacher's effectiveness. So just to pull together, I think, sort of the common lessons from the two studies, we found that teachers from both highly selective and less selective alternative certification programs can help fill teacher shortages without decreasing student achievement. And in the case of Teach for America and the Teaching Fellows programs, secondary math teachers from these programs can actually increase student math achievement in some cases. We also, this consistent finding across both studies that coursework taken while teaching may decrease a teacher's effectiveness. So this suggests that maybe having to take coursework while you're teaching a class diverts your time and attention from your class. And then finally, we both found this common finding that it's really difficult to predict a teacher's effectiveness just based on these characteristics you observe on the teacher's resume, and maybe some of the more in-depth screening procedures that programs like Teach for America and Teaching Fellows programs use are better at gauging how effective a teacher is likely to be when he or she enters the classroom. So now we'll turn this over to Vicki Bernstein.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks to IES and Mathematica for inviting me today, as well as for sponsoring the study. I think it has some great bearings on the work that we're doing now and in the future. As a full disclosure, I am predisposed to be favorably responding to these results. I was involved in starting the New York City Teaching Fellows back in 2000 in conjunction with TNTP and oversaw the work of that for a number of years directly, along with our partnership with Teach for America that supplied teachers to New York City for close to 20 years now. So again, welcome these results in particular, but happy in the work that doing over the years. As additional context, New York City, obviously we're the largest school district in the nation. We have 1 million kids, up to about 1,700 schools now, 74,000 or so teachers. Last year we hired about 5,000 teachers. We're on track to do about the same when we finish out our staffing for this year. Alternative certification historically had made up a larger share, but the last couple of years we make up about 20% of our hires, but more than a third of our hires in our highest need subject areas like math, special education, and science. Our alternative certification, we have a number of programs, but the largest programs are certainly Teaching Fellows first, and then Teach for America, and we now have some smaller residency programs in particular. Over the years, we have become, for all of our pipeline and all our pathway programs, much more rigorous and aggressive and selective in our hiring, so including our Teaching Fellows and including our traditional candidates. So everybody, one of the big changes that we saw since 2005 really is that all of our teachers have to be certified. That was a change for us. We, at our peak in 2001 to 17% of our teachers, and at one point 60% of all of our hires didn't have any certification. So it's a big shift for us, and one of the reasons why we moved towards alternative certification programs was to be able to find enough teachers, never mind quality teachers, but enough qualified teachers for our schools. But I think a big impact for us over this time is also that we have been able to ratchet up our screening and selection process so that we have a more robust pool for our schools. Over the last 5 years, we've averaged about 4.5 applicants for every traditional hire. For our Teaching Fellows program, I think 1 in 16 over the last 5 years, so very selective. But that selectivity goes down when you look at our shortage areas. So for math, for example, that's been more like 2.5 candidates for every area as compared to elementary, where it's 10 or more candidates for every vacancy that we have. So our job at Central is to create a pool of candidates for our schools, because the schools themselves are doing the hiring to make sure that they get the best matches for their schools. And so in that context, I think that the study affirms for us that the strategy that we've had of investing into the alternative certification programs to help meet our needs
has been a good one and one that we should continue. And I think that's no small matter because these programs do take an investment. They cost more than just hiring a traditional candidate. We are supporting much of the additional recruitment costs, certainly training and support costs, and in our case, candidates have to go through a full master's program, and we subsidize that considerably for both of the programs. And like earlier studies, I think, of course, we're very pleased to show that the outcomes on average for children are at least as good as, and in some cases better than, people from other pathways, in particular for New York City. Based on earlier studies, we know that they're better than outcomes from those uncertified teachers. So I think we're pleased that those results continue. And to some extent, I think that we believe, along with, I'm sure, TNTP and TFA, that we've gotten better and better, and we get better every year in selection, so that if you were to continue doing this analysis, that hopefully you would see better results, even though at the same time I think we do better at our screening and selection of traditional candidates or candidates from other pathways. So we think that hopefully all boats are rising at the same time. But of course, I think we know that these are average results, and we appreciate the fact that it's saying that if a principal is selecting somebody from one of these programs, they're on average possibly going to do better, and on average not necessarily do worse than hiring somebody from another pathway. But that is by no means the basis by which they should be making a hiring decision. And we would never encourage schools to only pick candidates on the basis of their pathway, whether it is a Teach for America person or just somebody who graduated from Hunter College or somebody who came from a different kind of pathway. We believe deeply that match matters, and that matters for schools and for teachers, and so teachers should have choice in that as well, because that's going to make a better experience for them and make them more willing to stay in the schools, so that they need to look under the hood for those other things that are going to make somebody a good fit for that school. And that's not just in a quick interview, that's in a series of interviews, demonstration lessons, ideally bringing the people to the schools to see the schools, meet other colleagues and candidates, and that you would never want to have a school that has only like one type of teacher, that's not necessarily a good thing as well. So what's important, I think, coming out of the study is that it affirms that for districts and for states, alternative certification is a means to increase the pool of candidates for schools to consider for hire. And inherently, if you have more people for them to consider, they're going to be able to have choice and make better selection. So historically, we may have had schools, not long ago, but 10, 15 years ago in the Bronx, we might have had South Bronx high schools that they had a math vacancy. They didn't have a lot of choice. They may have been lucky to get somebody who was willing to come and work for them. The fact that we are able to grow a pool of candidates who not are just qualified to be able to be hired, but are higher quality, and to put those people in front of the school so that they can have that choice, the same choice that a school in Lower Manhattan may have had, is incredibly important for us and for our schools. And we think will increase outcomes for kids. I think, another takeaway here from this is both studies and all the studies that seem to keep coming out, which is the vexing problem of how can we predict from selection teacher effectiveness. And it's disappointing, again, but not surprising because it's a consistent finding and theme that those tangible characteristics like GPA or test scores are not necessarily predictive of success as a teacher. In this case, I think the finding around college coursework in the content area not being predictive is an interesting one as well. There were some modest differences, I think, on the high school level for the math content knowledge, but that was from a pretty dramatic difference in performance on the exams. And so I think it becomes, again, this just reaffirms that it's important for districts and schools to dig in around selection, not to just go on the superficial, and to dig in to find those intangibles, to continue the work collaboratively that we're doing with the Teach for Americas and TNTPs and other researchers to try to think of what are those other characteristics that may lead to successful teachers and how can you identify them. It's hard work, but I think it's important work for us to do. But for everybody to know that there's no magic bullet that we're going to find, that we're only going to be able to figure out maybe who are the better bets, or in our case, sometimes we think we'll probably could do a better job of identifying who are the bad bets. So don't even consider these people because there's a good chance they're going to wash out quickly. that might be an easier way to go. But I think the message here also might be that hopefully policymakers, particularly at the state level, to reconsider where there are requirements that are onerous in terms of time and dollars and may even be dissuading people from entering the profession that are not found to be tied to success in the classroom. And I know it's challenging because it seems like to be a successful math teacher, you should know the content, and you should somebody who seems to know the content better should be a more successful teacher. So I think it's hard for those policymakers to reconsider those kinds of requirements, but it really, I think, we see here that it can have a negative impact, particularly, again, around the cost. It's no small amount of money that's going into this, either at an individual level or district level, and so we would hope that that we would look more closely at some of those requirements, particularly, again, at states that tend to impose those on districts, and what is really necessity, what is really essential, even just letting go a little bit, I would say. The final is also on the coursework, and again, this is just an enormous expense, not in every place. In New York State, we do have a requirement that alternate route candidates take essentially a master's, so it is the equivalent of what traditional candidates do. So it's not, as someone early on said to me, it's not really alternative certification, it's just alternative to the same set of requirements. And it's sort of funny, this should feel like it'd be a big duh that if you're, the same time you're a first-year teacher, and anybody who's ever been a first-year teacher or talked to first-year teachers just knows that that is just the most overwhelming experience of all. And to couple with that outside of everything you're trying to do to survive and make your students thrive in the classroom, that you have to spend I think that time frame of 150-ish hours, that equates to 5 hours a week, and that is of seat time in coursework, and that doesn't take into account travel and then assignments, so probably double that, 10 hours a week of precious time outside of what you're doing for your school. I mean, you'd have to be having, ice cream sundaes and masseuses to make it worthwhile for these people to be spending the time doing this, I think. And the sad part about it is it's an enormous investment, and I appreciate our institutions of higher education that they're doing their best in trying to convey information and to raise the skills of the students, the teachers at the time. But there is just no way those people are going to be able to take value at that moment in their careers from that coursework. And so it is just not the right investment of anybody's time, money, the expertise of the faculty, and I think it should be strongly reconsidered. We have asked in New York for the capacity for us to certify our own, and we know that people will look on that suspiciously because we would want to do that in a way that is less, if at all, about the conventional seat time and much more about the clinical but in-school experience. And we'd appreciate if the New York and others, I think the findings from here definitely show that it's worth looking further at that. There are, I think, movement from universities to move towards more clinical experiences, but to the extent these studies show that alternative certification candidates are just as successful, whether they are spending time from selective programs, spending time in coursework after or not. In fact, they are less successful if they're spending time during their first years. I think it's inherent on us to say if it's an alternative route candidate, we need to lighten up on their load in those early years and reconsider whether it's necessary at all. Thanks.
I'm very pleased to be here. I could not help but think, as I prepared for this, of my experience in 2003 when there was a White House conference on teacher quality in the White House, and I'm not Vicki Bernstein in case I'm this person, and so my job, and I didn't know a lot about teacher preparation or teacher effectiveness at that point, but my job was to summarize the research, and there was some, but it wasn't a lot. So I remember, filling up my 12 minutes with doing things like asking people to raise their hand if they remembered an effective teacher in their life and an ineffective teacher. And so one of the things that impresses me about what we just heard, both in particular and in context, is just how much we have come in a decade in terms of the research enterprise and what it has accomplished in terms of informing us about topics that are critical to policy and practice. So, a big thumbs up to IES and to Mathematica for doing this work, and I think it's important, and it's part of a larger enterprise in which we're moving from education decision-making based on intuition to education decision-making that at least occasionally takes a look at data, and there's data there, and it helps make a better decision. One of my takeaways from what we just heard, and I think it's certainly consistent with the final points that Vicki was making, is that this is really a telling and dramatic indictment of teacher preparation in this country. You cannot look at these data and come to any conclusion other than that preparation experience is by and large useless in terms of the impact of teachers in the classroom. Whether it's delivered in a traditional way or whether it's delivered as a requirement for people entering the profession through alternative routes, it's still the case that we see here no evidence that any of that makes a difference. And it does come with incredible cost in terms of barriers to entering the profession, the actual cost of delivering programs. There's a long literature that builds on what we've seen here in terms of the negative effect of taking coursework while you're teaching, and it's a long-standing and still highly prevalent incentive system in almost every district in the country for getting a master's degree. Well, what does that mean? I actually used to teach in the evening and weekend courses that teachers would go to get these master's degrees, and useless, really. It seemed to me at the time it was useless, even though I was providing it, and clearly it's disruptive in terms of other things that are being done. So for goodness sakes, it's an indictment of that whole teacher preparation industry, and it's an indictment of No Child Left Behind, which had at its core a teacher quality requirement that was based on credentials, reacting to the fact that there were a lot of teachers out there who weren't certified, and saying that every child has to have a certified teacher. And what does that mean? It means that they have to have the coursework state has said they have to have if they're going to get that certification. The coursework does not make a difference, at least in this broad sense. And so we really do need to think about it, and state policymakers and the federal government has been known to intervene here, as it did with No Child Left Behind. So it might even get involved in thinking about a move from a definition of teacher quality that's based on credentials to a definition that's based on actual effectiveness in a clinical setting. If you look at this, and if you are a TFA person or a TNTP person, you might say, well, this is great for us. And it is, in the sense that all other things being equal, it looks like it'd be better to hire a TFA person to teach math in high school than somebody who was coming into teaching through another route. But I do want to point out that this is not a home run for TFA. Melissa mentioned it in passing in her comments, but if you look carefully at the full study, you'll see that the kids in the classrooms of the teaching fellow teachers and the TFA teachers were from 0.4 to 0.5 standard deviations behind average for their state at the end of the year. Right? So they were doing better than they would have done had they had the bad luck of the draw and gotten the traditionally trained teacher in the same school. But it's not as if these teachers were able to raise their academic achievement to a point that's average. And so depending how you calculate this, they ended the year more than a year behind the average child in their state in terms of math knowledge. So even when we are attracting into teaching graduates who have a lot of job experience, switching careers, as is the case for teaching fellows, or the brightest graduates of the best colleges and universities, we still don't know how to teach what kids need to know effectively. And so we need to know much more, not only about the selection process, but also a lot more about the instruction process if we're going to get it right. One indication of that is if the differences in the effectiveness of teachers within any of these categories, whether it's Teach for America or Teaching Fellows or traditional training, if you just look at the distributions are much larger within the routes than they are between the routes. And so you could find in these within school studies, a Teach for America teacher whose students are almost 2 standard deviations better at the end of the year than the students in the contrasting teachers classroom. But you can also find that flip so that Teach for America classroom, the kids are almost a standard deviation behind. And so you're getting, over 2 standard deviations of difference in teacher effectiveness within each of these routes, and about a 1/10 of a standard deviation between the routes. Again, what it's indicating is that we don't know a lot about what represents effective teaching in terms of things we can easily measure. What is effective teaching is effective teaching. That is, it is classroom performance. It's the ability to inspire kids and get their scores up, and we don't know it until we've seen it. We've seen it happen. One of the things that I'm reminded of as I'm sitting here is that I did not have a good cursive writing instructor when I was when I was on school. What exactly does this say? I'm thinking. So we do not know how to predict effective teaching. It is pretty much dependent on the demonstration of it in the classroom. So what's next in terms of policy, in terms of teaching and related research? We really do need to get a handle on what it is that effective teachers are doing in the classroom that makes them effective. And the Gates Measures of Effective Teaching project was a huge effort to try to collect that information. I actually haven't seen results from that yet that indicate that we learned anything from it. I think probably people are still looking at the tapes. So what is it when you go into a classroom that represents effective teaching? Is it and of those things that might differentiate the more effective from the less effective teachers, which of those are personality and performance art things that are very difficult to transmit, and which of them are transmittable and could be incorporated into training? And once we know that, then how do we incorporate it in training? And are there teachers who are better suited for certain types of interventions than others? So there's a tremendous research agenda here. And until it's carried out and we learn the answers, we're going to be left with the very difficult situation of putting teachers in the classroom, and some of them are going to be great, and some of them are going to be terrible. And the children who get the terrible ones are very negatively affected by that. I've been commuting to Washington for almost 13 years, so I get on a plane at least twice a week. And there's no concern on my part. I'm a little bit concerned because I've started flying a commuter plane instead of a big plane, so there's an empirical reason to be a little bit concerned about that. But I don't check out the credentials of the pilot. Right? I'm pretty sure they're good enough to get me where they're going, and they've been that so far. But there's no assurance when you drop your child off to school that teacher is going to be good enough to get your child where your child needs to go. And of course, training somebody to fly a plane is easier in many respects than training somebody to teach, but it does indicate how little we know about how to successfully prepare teachers. So we need to know what effective teaching is. We don't know it. And once we know it, we need to figure out how to transmit the transmittable portions to teachers on the job or in training. We need to know that not just in a research context, multi-millions of dollars from Gates with, video 2 hours a day and somebody sitting there coding it. We need to know how to do that in a practical sense, because school districts in New York City public schools and all the others need some way of differentiating effective from ineffective teachers, and they cannot spend, they can't have cores of observers looking at videotapes and scoring them for reliability. So we need practical ways of doing this. And once we have practical ways of identifying effective teaching and what its components are, it needs to be fed into the human resources process. We heard a lot from Vicki about how the New York City public schools go about recruiting, that it's a much larger pool than it used to be, which seems to me a good thing. But, I think it's entirely mysterious what HR departments do if they're responsible for selection, or what principals do if they're responsible for it. On what basis are they doing that? And does it have any validity whatsoever? And if that could be made more empirical, so that there are things that we could know about teachers as they're applying for jobs that could feed into the selection process, it would be great. So the recruitment process needs to be changed. Compensation, if we know which ones are good, should we be paying them more? Should the math shortages and special education shortages, which are real, should that be met as you would in an ordinary marketplace by paying more to get people into the positions you need? As, for example, universities pay economists much more than they pay psychologists when I was in a university. Why shouldn't public schools be able to respond to needs with differential pay? But we need research about that. Training, who needs to be trained and how do they need to be trained? I think we've learned that coursework is not the way to do it, but that's not to say we have a body of knowledge about what the right way to do it is. So, the people from Mathematica and other work that was funded by the federal government could stand up and tell you how much we've learned about what doesn't work in terms of professional development of teachers. Where to place teachers, most of this work is done with teachers who are teaching in difficult to staff schools. How transmittable are the teacher skills that we're seeing here? Do teachers who can teach with one type of population in one school, can they do it in other schools? A very important question. And then there is the politically difficult but real question of deselection. I mean, the introduction of a teacher into the teacher workforce until recently has meant the opportunity of lifetime employment. It's been an effective tenure job. And yet you can't look at these results, particularly as they're disaggregated by schools, and not see that there's some really terrible teachers there. And so where do you get to a point in the process where an ordinary business would say, this person is doing a terrible job and we need to replace them? And that is possible now based on information on classroom performance. And so it's an important part of what we need to learn and what we need to apply. So I think what we see here is all the evidence finally that we need to convince policymakers who are willing to look at the evidence that we need to move from credentials to classroom performance as a major currently available way of defining what represents effective teaching or useful teaching or teaching that we need to encourage more of. We need changes in policy that will allow us to go in that direction. Like New York State, please stop requiring teacher fellows to take the same coursework that they would have had to take if they were regularly certified, and have that interfere with their job while they're doing it. You're wasting money, you're wasting everybody's time, and you're making very good people say, I'm just not willing, I'm not going to go through that, who would otherwise be great teachers. So we need to move from credentials to effectiveness, and once we move to effectiveness, we need to find out what effectiveness really is and find out how not just to select for it, but also to train for it. Thank you.
Well, thank you to everyone for your presentations and your comments. I think there's plenty here to respond to, so I want to open it up to the audience for questions. And when you're posing your questions, if you would please, whether it's in person or online, be sure to state your name and affiliation. And we're going to ask you only to ask one question so that we can get to as many as we can in the remaining time that we have. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from the audience here first and then sort of go back and forth between the audience and the webinar. So if there's anybody here that has a question, please go ahead. And
great. Hi, I'm Chris Price from APT. And what I wanted to ask is quite a technical question, and you might not know the answer, but I think it is really important given, like that Russ just said, what we know is that there are really terrible teachers and good teachers. So in Jill's study, where you have randomization blocks within you've randomized kids to pairs of teachers, I think. So within
not always a pair, but okay.
a block or a pair. What would be really interesting to see, if you haven't already reported this, is how much variation is there in teacher effectiveness within those blocks? And what would make it really compelling is if you were able to show with the same analysis that you should be able to show that the same students' pretest scores, that there's no variation attributable to teachers within those blocks. And then with their post-test scores or end-of-year scores, how much variation has emerged. Do you follow the question?
Yeah, and without kind of getting too bogged down in the technical, because you could be talking about a couple of different things. That point that Russ made, that there is the variation within the different routes and then within the pairs is much larger than the across is true. And then we do have, it is sort of buried in an appendix to go look at. If you're sort of asking about a homogeneity of effects, we did actually test for that. It probably is buried in the appendix in a footnote. So you should look at that. So I think that takeaway point that Russ makes, though, is a good one. And we actually do have one nice figure that shows those pairs and shows this idea of, okay, so actually, and it shows the post-test accounting for the pre-test. So we've even taken care of that variation already. It's all what we call regression adjusted. And we do have these figures where, on one end, you see the TC students of the TC kids a standard deviation ahead of the students of the AC kids, and on the other end, you see it exactly in reverse. And that basically it's all clumping around zero, which is why we get the no effects. So, I think I may or may not have answered the question, but I did want to reinforce Russ's point, and then there may be an answer. But if not, please let me know.
Do we have a question from our webinar?
Sure. So first of all, I'd like to encourage people to send in their questions. We don't have very many at this point, but there is a question for all the panelists, and that is, if coursework and preparation do not make a difference in terms of student achievements, do the respondents agree that there should be no minimum bar for entry into the teaching profession?
We start with Russ and then Vicki.
Well, there needs to be a minimum bar. We don't know what it is. So the minimum bar is now presumed to be a college degree. My guess is if we could look at variation on that. We can't look at variation on that now because everybody who goes into teaching has a college degree. I bet if we looked at variation around that, we would also not find strong effects. So we need one, but to repeat myself, I don't think we know exactly what it is. We want to encourage people to go to college, so maybe we should make that the minimal bar just so there's some incentive on that end.
I think that, there's a difference between a minimum bar to be considered and someone actually entering the profession. We lived in an environment in New York City for a long time, and other districts as well, where you could hire anybody. Basically, if somebody wanted to become a teacher in New York City, they said, okay, come down with your fingers. That's the first thing. We just have to get you fingerprinted. That's really the only requirement, I suppose. If we had people without prints, they couldn't be eligible to be hired. But there's a difference between that and selectivity. I don't think anything here is suggesting that there should be no selectivity. The question is whether you should have some just GPA or a test or coursework requirements as that or not. And I think that to have no standards is the wrong answer. There have to be some standards. And I also think it's careful. The study didn't say that preparation coursework was not effective. I think it's essential that before entering the classroom, a teacher from whatever pathway have some preparation, and that doesn't have to take necessarily the form of coursework, and there's other studies I think that show that some of the clinical experiences, the student teaching-like experiences, whether it's from an alternate or a traditional route, are essential. But there are some basics that people need to know in order not to do great harm upon entry into the classroom. So I don't think anybody here would argue for absolutely no requirements, but that they don't be arbitrary. And also I don't think anybody would argue for no selectivity, that the selectivity is still important. And as much as we can learn about those other characteristics that we think are essential, and some of those, for example, are critical thinking, but critical thinking does not necessarily equate to a test score. So I think that we need to differentiate how you think about the selection.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a question we were able to directly address in our study, so if we're just speculating, I defer to people who know a lot more about teaching and education than I do, Vicki and Russ. But, I mean, I do think, even though the Teach for America students were still well below average in our study at the end of the school year, the teachers were still doing something right. Their students were still outperforming the students of comparison teachers by a meaningful, statistically significant amount. So, I think that means we can't easily observe these criteria on a teacher's resume that will help us say whether or not he or she will be a good teacher. But clearly, maybe there's something to be learned from these more in-depth approaches to thinking about who's going to be effective in the classroom. Maybe it's not a simple, do they have a master's degree in math? It's something more in-depth, but I think maybe our findings suggest that Teach for America is successfully predicting who can be effective, and maybe there's something to be learned there.
Yeah, I think it's worth reminding people that there are some pretty serious bars in both of these studies, right? Even in the less selective, as Russ said, everybody has a bachelor's. Everybody completed college, and even though for some states coursework wasn't required, you saw on average most people had taken some, and sometimes a lot, and same with TFA and teaching fellows. They are doing something before they enter the classroom. So there are some pretty significant barriers. And in all these comparisons, too, we're not, everybody's, so another interesting thing about these studies, everybody's certified, right, in some way. So you're not looking at this compared to uncertified or emergency substitutes or anything like that. So there are other people who could be out there. You could have made some comparisons that would have made you go, oh boy, you better at least do this. So I think it just comes back to what Russ is saying. There should be some selection, and probably a few of those things we're doing, bachelor's and some other things is a good idea, but some other things we're doing, like master's, and you can see in the less selective study, in some of our analysis, we actually find having a master's degree to be associated with lower those teachers, students have lower student achievement. So it's more about being thoughtful about what we're selecting on.
I think it's, if I could just add, I think it's also about when we do the selection. So you could imagine a relatively low bar for entry, which is what is the case now in most states and most cities, but a much higher bar for tenure. If the best predictions we have about quality teaching are performance in the classroom, then if we could use that information over the first 2 or 3 years to make a decision about who stays, has the opportunity to stay in the profession, and who should look for work in another profession, I think that would be the easiest way, given what we know now, to select and to have that selection have a large impact on student achievement.
Have another question from the audience?
Hi, Michelle McLaughlin from Knowledge Alliance. My full disclosure is that I worked at Teach for America, so get that out of the way. My question's not about Teach for America, so thankfully. So it seems like my question is actually from Ms. Bernstein. It seems like New York City has been pretty well studied in this area. There's been IES-funded research, and there's been other research done, using administrative data sets. I was curious if you've seen a change in practice, because now that you know more about candidates, that you are actually a big hirer of teachers on an annual basis. Are you seeing teacher prep programs change their practice? What are you seeing in the field?
I think we are seeing some change in practice. I mean, we have certainly changed in practice, and part of this is just that we used to, out of necessity, almost have to, again, take anybody who came in, the door, because we had such large needs and such a churn every year of teachers. And it's not to say we weren't trying to get good people. We were, but I think we've become much more rigorous around that work. We actually have everybody apply now. They didn't all used to apply with a common application, with an essay and resumes. At one point, people said, it's easier to apply to get jobs here than to Rite Aid or something. I mean, they had we have a consistent review of everybody, and we have able to leverage technology given our scale to make that information available while candidates available to schools, and to do much more work around thinking about matching and the like. So I think we have our own recruitment and screening process have changed considerably, and I think a lot of that has been informed by our work with the GSA and TNTP about how to do that more than just sort of the, hey, you want to teach, you're great, where would you like to teach, what would you like to teach? I think the universities, I mean, there's been enormous pressure, I think everybody knows, over the last number of years on them to try to become more relevant, to use a sort of trite term. My concern is that some of their response to that, for example, in adding more of clinical, is it's additive. So it's on top of the 36 conventional credits that you have to take. Now you also have to do these clinical experiences, and not just one. We want you to do one in a this kind of school and in that kind of school, and we want you to do that before you're a teacher of record. So it's just not scalable, and it takes again more resources. There's not been ways to really think about how to integrate that into the experience of preparation and support. And I mean, one thing I'm hopeful of, I think, is that the Common Core, to be fair to universities, we've made it hard for them to align their programs because what are you aligning to? I mean, we have a little bit of everything going on in our schools. And I think the Common Core, as well as for us, our adoption of the Danielson rubric and standards for teacher evaluation, I think give them a couple of anchors to be able to think more about how they can align their programs better. But it can't just be adding on. And that's what the states have done as well. It's like, we also worry that people need to know about language acquisition. So everybody has to have taken 6 credits of a foreign language, Everybody should have, now knowledge of autism. Now they have to take a course in autism. And it's just layers and layers without thinking about, okay, how does it all fit together so it's not a big jumble and, take a lot of time and money and put people off and not really add value.
Great.
A question from Jesslyn Haller, I think this is both for Jill and Melissa. It appears that your only metrics for teacher effectiveness were student test scores. Did you look at any other measures of teacher effectiveness? And if not, why not?
Yeah, so I'll start. We also looked at teacher practices using a tool at the time. It was called the Vermont Classroom Observation Tool, that was built off the Danielson framework. And we actually have it in a backup slide. We actually saw, again, for the low coursework teachers in particular, no differences. And then for the high coursework differences, you actually saw lower scores on those observation tools for the alternative certified. Again, these are for the high coursework ones. And they were very large difference. It wasn't statistically significant because now you're just looking at the sample of teachers. You're not looking at the over 2,000 kids. You're just looking at the 74 pairs of teachers. So they were large, but they weren't statistically significant. So we thought that was interesting. But, of course, when we tried to correlate those teacher practices to anything about student achievement, they didn't matter for student achievement. So you do see this difference. So it was almost as if, at least for the high coursework case, whatever people who develop those tools think is important, those traditionally certified teachers were doing it more, the ones that were compared to the high coursework. It just didn't matter for the student achievement.
Yeah, and in our study, we only measured student math achievement. We didn't look at these other measures, and I think in part that was because Jill's study and other studies had found that these measures of classroom practice really weren't predictive of student achievement. And in the end, that's at least I think one of the important things we really care about is how much students are learning. And, it seems like test scores are one really important measure of that. There might be other measures you also care about that, if a teacher's practice, as we're able to measure it, doesn't translate into more achievement, then it's probably not worth the resources for a given study to collect that data. We purposely didn't spend study resources to collect that information. We instead spent it on having larger samples of students and teachers so we could have a more precise analysis of the teachers' effects on test scores.
Hi,
Hi, it's Andrew Wayne from the American Institutes for Research, and congratulations on a really successful study, and I'm sure a ton of work that it took to carry it off. So it's a very important study, and I thought that one of the important questions that I found myself really curious about is this issue of scalability, which was referenced earlier. And it seems that, at least from what I know of the programs, they're very thoughtful about selection. That is, it's not just GPA and other test score measures of the teachers before they become teachers, but rather some really thoughtful criteria that have been worked out over time. In studying TSA in the past, I recall one of the criteria being relentlessness, and they have a whole model around how you select teachers who are really relentless in their pursuit of their goals. But the findings made me optimistic about the promise of these programs, but wonder about their scalability. If selectiveness and this careful selection is so important, do we know something, or is there some evidence in the study about how scalable the two programs are? And I do mean that separately for the two programs. My sense is the answer may differ by program.
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a really important one. I mean, obviously, we've shown the Teach for America teachers had really positive effects, but what would happen if Teach for America tried to double the size of its teacher corps? Could it maintain these same selection standards? Could it maintain the same infrastructure to provide the same quality of training and support to its teachers? And actually, in 2010, Teach for America received an Investing in Innovation grant to address exactly that question. So they received $50 million to scale up their program by 80% over 5 years. And as part of the I3 grants, they had to hire an independent evaluator to assess whether they could maintain their effectiveness as they scaled up their program. So Mathematica is the independent evaluator for that study, and we're going to be looking at, were they able to maintain their effectiveness as they grow their program by this dramatic amount? So it's a really important question. We don't know the answer yet, but hopefully that study will provide some evidence.
If I can just speak to that as well, I mean, I think part of this is also a question of, I guess, marketing, really. Can you generate enough interest in this? And a lot of that is local context. I mean, we're fortunate, I think, in New York City, in many cases, is a draw, so we can get more interest. But we always felt in the early years of the teaching fellows, when we initially got 8,000 applications and then 20,000 applications, well, maybe we're just getting the low-hanging fruit of people out there who are interested, and at some point this is going to tail off. And we've been able to sustain that and grow that, and I think part of it, again, is that both programs locally and nationally, I think, have generated more and more interest in becoming teachers, as has sort of the general, I think, notion of it being, the civil rights movement of our day and important work, and having more and more pathways, not just those, but whether people are becoming interested in going into education, feeling like that's important work. I think the programs have had an impact in that, just generating an interest in the profession, and I think there may be continuing momentum around that. That means that you can draw in still the same quality of individual, and to the extent that we still don't know whether the person that you didn't select wasn't as good as the person that you did select. I mean, we've had years for teaching fellows, we had 2,400 at our peak and 400 at our low point, and so obviously very different selectivity even among the candidates, and so we don't know that we really did any worse taking some people in those big years where they might not have taken in years where we were more selective. We thought, oh, this is fabulous. We can finally really dig in on who we think is going to be great, but we don't know that we could always make the right decisions, and still the mystery of who you're selecting is not telling yet of whether having more or fewer is going to matter. I think this will be an important study to help inform that to some extent.
And if I could add, there is a very important research question embedded in your question and Vicki's response, and it is, are these selection measures that are so much a part, particularly of TFA, and I assume for teaching fellows as well, are they valid? And that's answerable. That's answerable first in terms of variation on relentlessness among those that you have selected. And it's certainly answerable by, kind of natural shocks to your admissions pool, where you've selected lower down on whatever the scale is one year than on other years. And we really need to know, because if there is a secret sauce in the measures that are being applied to selection into these selection programs, then that would be useful probably to everybody, and we ought to have it out there so that the HR departments aren't just, throwing darts at the board and thinking they're doing something different, which is the situation now.
Not our HR department.
The principals do it.
Okay. Are there other questions in the audience here?
Okay, another question from Kim Himes. How much does Teach for America pay to support their teacher corps per teacher versus traditional schools? And is TFA investing more in their teachers through mentoring, induction programs, et cetera?
I actually don't know those numbers off the top of my head. I imagine, of course, Teach for America could easily answer those questions. It's not data we collected for this study, so I'm not sure.
I think it's about $80,000 for a typical TFA core member over the course of their experience in the schools. I may be wrong, but that's just
I may be using my memory, but I think Stephen Sawchuk put that at the end of one of his articles this week, and I think I remember 45,000. But if anybody else remembers,
so it's real money.
And it's
more than $1 and less than $1 million.
And we actually tried to look at the cost question in the less selective route. And the problem is in the comparison, it's very hard to kind of, for the traditional certification, it's very hard to tease out because it's all part of an undergraduate education. So it's very hard to kind of say, oh, this is what it costs to go through the traditionally certified route, as opposed to some of these other routes where it's all occurring, post baccalaureate, and you can do it. So sometimes you can get a handle, particularly on some of these kind of programs, because there's specific streams and pockets of money supporting them, but it's very difficult to get it on the traditional path. And then it gets even more complicated when you think about undergraduate education is sometimes subsidized, by state institutions and things like that. So.
And it looked like maybe, Vicki, you were going to say something about some other issues?
I was only going to say, it's a question of who pays or not as well. Right, the traditional, for us, the cost for traditional is often zero, or we might have some incentive programs, but for where we're subsidizing to Teach for America and teaching fellows to make it viable for them to enter the profession, there's a more substantial cost. But I know TFA is around the 40,000 number, but that includes all of their everything work so per candidate. And I think part of the question was also they do support their candidates in the classroom. They have program managers who visit them and observe them and provide them guidance. Sometimes that is tied to other seminar-type, workshop-type programs they have.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Is there any?
Duncan Chaplin, Mathematica. This might just be a reminder, but the TFA study looked at math but not reading. Can you just remind me why?
Sure. We were looking at secondary math, and the reason is that's one of the major areas in which high-poverty schools face shortages of teachers. So that was the primary reason. Math and science are actually two of the main subjects in special ed, as Vicki mentioned. The reason we focused on math instead of science was really a practical one. So we considered also looking at science, but there weren't reliable assessments available across all grade levels in science, and there were some great assessments available for math.
Okay. Any other questions?
Can Vicki talk about retention rates for high needs areas, particularly special education for alternative route teachers?
Actually, special education, interestingly, we tend to have higher retention, I think both traditional and alternative routes. For teaching fellows, it's consistent with, I think it was in the report, about 3/4 of those who will start will teach a third year in New York City. For Teach for America, it tends to be more like 40-ish%. So not surprisingly, there's a big drop-off after that second year for TFA, that being their model. But math is an area where, not surprisingly, we tend to have lower retention if you break it out by a subject area, even by pathway, just because I think, the nature of the people who are teaching mathematics are sometimes people who have more choices in alternative fields as well. But overall, our retention has been improving over this period, I think, both for teaching fellows and our traditionally prepared teachers, and even TFA, although TFA, again, is a very specific model, so it's expected that some of those folks are not going to stick around after the 2 years. They go in with that expectation.
Okay, great. I think we're just about out of time. I want to thank all of our panelists for a great discussion today. I, at least, enjoyed it thoroughly. And actually, I should say, rest assured, the evaluation agenda at IES is not complete. We'll be doing more research in the area of teacher preparation, and these comments were extremely helpful because I think, we're starting to be on the right path. We just need to keep pushing on this. It's a very important issue. Thank you all so much for coming. And I guess there are some comment cards in your folders here if you want to give us advice about how this forum went. I thought it was successful enough. We really should do it again. And I think we might have some reports coming up in which that might make sense. So thank you so much for coming.